And I had had this dream for so long because I have a traditional background in media, wanting to basically run my own kind of one-man media company. And so there was this kind of surge in newsletter adoption starting in circa 2013, 2014. And that's when I started my newsletter. I was publishing a lot on Medium back then, and had built up like 15,000 followers on Medium. It's like halfway through one of my articles on Medium, I would have like some kind of interruption that would say, "Do you like this article so far? Well, you should sign up for my newsletter."
Hey everyone, welcome to Behind the Frames. My name is Alex, and today we're joined by Simon Owens. Simon is the founder and author behind the Simon Owens media newsletters, where on a weekly basis, he will cover and provide commentaries on key industry events evolving around advertising, platform, and media.
What's my original kind of contrarian spin on this thing? And if I can come up with something that's like given an original way of thinking, then I'll go for it. So if you were to ask me this question in like 2019, so the most of my income came from these corporate clients that wanted me to create content for their blogs, their newsletters, their social media accounts. Now today, close to 100%, probably like 80 to 90% of my income.
In my conversation with Simon, we talked about the history and evolution of newsletters, and we also talked about Simon's writing process to capture key timely industry events while providing evergreen commentaries and analysis. And we also talked about the various business models that exist within publications and newsletters. And welcome to my conversation with Simon. So you're the author and the founder behind the Simon Owens media newsletter, and you brought a decade of professional experience from media, journalism, and business. The first question I wanted to ask is, what compelled you to start the Simon Owens newsletter?
Yeah, it originally started actually all the way back in 2014. The thing that people don't realize about newsletters today is it used to be like a huge burden to create a newsletter. There were two main companies. There was Constant Contact and there was MailChimp, and most people didn't have newsletters because you had to pay a lot of money to have them. And the amount that they charged went up based on how large your newsletter list was. So you were actually punished by having a larger and larger audience. And if you couldn't monetize it directly, it wasn't worth your time. So mainly the only publications that, or the only people who had newsletters for the most part were either media companies or just traditional companies that used them for marketing, and creators didn't really have it. And then the launch of Tiny Letter was the first newsletter platform that was completely free to use. It was acquired by MailChimp very early on. And so there was this kind of surge in newsletter adoption starting in circa 2013, 2014. And that's when I started my newsletter. And at first, it was just a great way to build an audience that I owned. At that point, I had been a journalist for several years. I had been doing a lot of consulting work and content marketing work inside. Like to use the newsletter as a way to keep up with my audience for whenever I was publishing something under my own name. And for the first 6 years or so, the newsletter was just a side hobby, something that I would send occasionally. I wasn't super steady or consistent. And that changed all in 2020. It was the beginning of the pandemic. There was just kind of this slight slowdown in consulting work because all my clients didn't know, what was going to happen to the economy and that, so they put everything on pause. And at that point, I had built up the list, I think over 1,000 people at that point. And I had had this dream for so long because I have a traditional background in media, wanting to basically run my own kind of one-man media company. And that's when I decided, this is the perfect time. We're actually right now at the 1-year anniversary, or 4-year anniversary is in late February 2020. I flipped on paid subscriptions and made an announcement and just basically made a go at it. And I've been working on it more or less full time, the newsletter and podcast since.
That's amazing. Like, what was the genesis version of the newsletter looks like?
Like the very first issue. I think it was just a roundup of links including like maybe a link to my latest article. And like I was publishing a lot on Medium back then, and had built up like 15,000 followers on Medium. So I would publish an article to Medium, and then I would have a call to action like the way that I drove people to sign up for the newsletter is like halfway through one of my articles on Medium, I would have like some kind of interruption that would say, do you like this article so far? Well, you should sign up for my newsletter and receive some of this in your inbox every week. And for the first like several years, that's how I got all my subscribers to my newsletter. So it was very bare bones back.
Absolutely. Like when we think about the model or like the history of newsletter, that's really interesting that you mentioned. Like back then it was very costly and there were many alternatives way to start a newsletter, and it's very costly. It was when maybe 2016, 2018, where like LinkedIn has started to come along and Medium and Substack were starting to become relevant in like 2019, 2020, since the pandemic hit. And all of a sudden, like newsletter has become such a popular, or it's become a new way where people usually wouldn't have access to, where they can connect with the audience from a written format. And it's really interesting to think about the newsletter space, where there are sort of two types of newsletters. So there's one type which is more evergreen. You would think about general principles, theses, tips and advice when it comes to a certain domain. And there's something that's more time sensitive. So you're looking at different like latest trends, events, news, announcements. Where would you, I see your platform to be somewhere in the middle, but I want to hear how you would describe it.
I think it's more topical in the sense of like whatever topic I pick that week is usually based off of something that has happened recently, whether it's, Spotify's podcast layoffs or, the Messenger shutting down. But I do try to tie that into some analysis that is evergreen in nature that will, be relevant for months after the fact. Like I'm trying to create like what are the actual things you can learn from that you could take from it, and then I think that is evergreen in nature. But I also do have a podcast, and it's kind of like this, where it's kind of long form interviews with really successful media entrepreneurs. So that's what I consider more of my evergreen content, and I've been getting more serious about posting it to the video versions to YouTube, and I'm now very slowly starting to see results as that. I've only been doing that for less than a year. And because YouTube is such a powerful search platform, not only is the YouTube search very powerful, but obviously it's integrated with Google search. My hope is that as that archive of interviews gets larger, I will have like a huge library of evergreen content that I can, capitalize on in that sense.
And when it comes to the library of content, this is something very synonymous to a lot of, especially newsletter creators, because a lot of times you may have old content that is relevant to, let's say, streaming, or like advertising and streaming, that you're able to leverage when Hulu does a new announcements, or like when Netflix introduce ads that you can pull over and talk about it. Like, do you have a system for doing this, or do you just kind of rely on your brain recalling what's been done?
It's like a lot of me recalling what's been done and or me knowing that I've written about it. So like, for instance, I wrote a big piece recently about advertising and the mistakes that like a lot of publishers have made about not focusing on programmatic display advertising versus native advertising. And I know that I've written a lot about native advertising in the past, but I might not remember exactly which piece. So I'll go into Google and type Simon Owens native advertising, and it'll bring up all my newsletter issues that I've written about native advertising before. So then I can go and grab the link to one of those that has like all the important things that I wanted to say and make sure to link to it within the news.
Awesome. And when you talk about different subjects, this is something that I also struggle with. It's like when you decide to start a newsletter, you have to kind of decide on what kind of niches, what kind of content buckets you want to hit. So when I think about the Simon Owens Media newsletter, it encompasses a pretty wide range of topics, like advertising, branding, platforms, creators, or even creator businesses. How do you sort of draw the line between like what kind of belongs to the newsletter, what is in scope, what is out of scope?
So I really just kind of put it the parameters of what really interests me. For the most part, it mainly focuses on kind of more bootstrap media companies or traditional media companies. So like you won't see me writing a lot about like Netflix or Hollywood or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, even though I'm really interested in that kind of stuff. And sometimes I'll link to that in my like link roundups, but you won't see me writing like 1,000-word piece about, the future of MCU and what it means for Disney, even though I'm interested in that, because I'm trying to say somewhat focus within with a realm, a parameter realm, that someone who's either an individual creator or someone working at like a traditional news or media company can find useful. And it's at some point, for some Hollywood studios, they just have access to so many more resources that it's not, you can't draw that many. If you're just a single YouTuber who has limited resources, you're not going to be able to draw insights from that kind of analysis. So I try to put the goals right there. But other than that, I don't really think through it. Every single morning I carve out like 2 to 3 hours to just read industry news. And so I'm just like, so I have that built into every single day, so that when it comes to Tuesday, like I write my newsletters on Tuesdays and Thursdays, when it comes to that day to write stuff, I usually like have read enough industry news that I'm like, okay, what's something original I can say that somebody else hasn't already said? Like, what is my original take on this? So like Vice just laid off like almost its entire staff, but there's so much been written about Vice at this point, and I've probably written about Vice a few times as well. Is like I might include something in my link roundup, what I call my quick hits, but I'm not going to devote an entire newsletter to that, just because there's just so much opinion and analysis about what went wrong with Vice at this point that I don't feel like I could add anything new. So I'm always trying to like, what's my original kind of contrarian spin on this thing? And if I can come up with something that's like given an original way of thinking, then I'll go for it. Like one example is like, all the coverage of the media right now is incredibly pessimistic. Like the New Yorker like wrote this piece like claiming that the media was heading for like an extinction level event. And so I wrote this piece called, I think the title was "The Long Tail of Media is Thriving." And I was pointing out that all the coverage of the media is focused on like this small subsection of the media that's like newspapers and traditional media companies. And yet you have this like huge long tail of the creator economy and all these bootstrap media outlets that are really thriving, but that never really kind of gets, added into the calculus of the state of the media industry. So I felt like I had an original take there that was kind of pushing against the general consensus of the coverage of the media industry.
When I think about the pieces that you wrote, they all has some kind of originality and opinions into it. Mm-hmm. So like I had a few examples, like one being like how platforms abandoned homegrown creators. So back then, like there would be like CPG companies or platforms who hire creators as a full-time employee to create content for them. Mm-hmm. But with time, they realized the economics doesn't really work in their favor, because content is one of those, it's really hit or miss. And when you hire employees, where you're looking at 2-year, 3-year, 4-year trajectory. Mm-hmm. Another piece that you wrote was like streaming companies started to advertise. When Netflix introduced the ad version, everyone was shocked, because they were like, I'm not paying like $10, $15, $20 to watch ads. Mm-hmm. But then it turns out like that become a very viable model, and Disney plus Hulu also follow it afterwards. So like these analyses were just really empowering and kind of just put you ahead of the curve. That's what I would simply summarize it as.
Thank you.
So when you talk about your writing process, you said you write every Tuesday and Thursday, and you read media news almost every day continuously. I want to get a little bit more tactical. So for someone who wanted to start a newsletter and do something in a similar format as you do, like, can you maybe walk us through a little bit of like how do you take notes? What kind of sources are you looking at? And let's start from there.
In terms of writing the newsletter, like a lot of times, so I'll basically open a Google Doc, and every single newsletter idea starts with a headline. I think the headline forces you to think concisely about what is this actually about. And this was like, a practice pulled over from my journalism days and also my content marketing days when I was working with clients, because clients are scatterbrained. They're not necessarily content oriented. So if I could get them to come up with a headline, then that would help them focus their thinking on what is this piece of content that we're going to create. So I always start with a headline, and then I'll just start like jotting down notes just like that are coming to my head of like different points I might want to hit. So it's not like a formal outline, but it's like just like a list of bullet points of like all these, like I'll just have like this brain dump, and it'll only take like maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And maybe it's why I'm reading something on Monday. So it's for something I'm not going to write for another 24 hours. So I'll just kind of like brain dump in there. And then I'll remember other like things that I had read over the previous several months that kind of supported my thesis. So I'll do a quick Googling to find those articles and throw them in there. But I won't actually like go through and reread all those articles right away. I'm just throwing stuff into the Google Doc so that when I'm ready to sit down and like actually start writing the piece, I have all these bullet points, all these extra sources. So then I can start kind of structuring it into an actual essay. And so, yeah, it's like a very kind of quick, I get the idea for the headline, and then I just start throwing ideas into the Google Doc. And let's say like, I'm kind of like, let's say I come up with the idea on Monday for my Tuesday newsletter. If I'm just kind of walking around and come up with another point that I should probably hit on, I will stop what I'm doing right there. So if I'm walking down the street or doing anything, I will stop where I am. I will pull up the Google Doc on my phone and jot down the idea or whatever the bullet point is, because so I don't forget it later. You have to like, and I'm sure every writer, every creative has some kind of version of this, has like a Google Doc or a notes app, or like stand-up comedians, I'm sure, have this too. It's like, as soon as you have the idea, you have to write it down or you're going to forget it 20 minutes later. So that has to be part of your creative process.
And I know there's one thing about the process that was pretty interesting to me. It's also very intuitive, is that you would post a lot of those brain dump articles on Substack. So there's like a feature on Substack which is called Notes.
Yeah.
That is a way where you can notify your readers, and you can have simple one-way sort of messaging where you can like just drop an article and be like, oh, this is the quick bite of what's happening. I'm going to include this in the X article. It's how sort of do you approach the Notes feature? How do you best leverage that feature?
So it's not just Notes, it's also my Facebook group, Notes, LinkedIn. It used to be Twitter, but now it's Threads, and then Blue Sky. If you look across all those platforms, I'm basically posting the same things to every platform. And that's part of what I was talking about earlier, the 2 to 3 hours I'm spending every day reading industry news. If I have some kind of very interesting thought on that, I'll just throw it off schedule it across all those different social media platforms. And that's my way of just, because I'm only sending out two newsletters a week, this is a way of hitting my audience with content throughout the day and keeping them consistently fed with little morsels and that in between the very larger meals that I'm doing. So it's part of my strategy of just kind of marketing and trying to slowly build influence and reach across all these different platforms. And then I'm sure you noticed with the newsletter, I then take up all those notes and then I put it in the newsletter itself as the quick hits section. So there's always a section that has those kind of smaller morsels before you get to the longer essay.
Has there been any sort of surprises, interactions that have come out of those conversations?
Yeah, all the time. A lot of my podcast guests are people who have commented on one of those and talked about their own experience, what they learned from their own media company. And I'd be like, oh, I'd comment back, oh, I want to hear more about your media company. You want to set up a phone call with me? And then I would email them my Calendly link, and then we would have set up a half-hour phone call. And
so in the journey of building a Simon Owens newsletters, like if you have to categorize it into different phases, how would you sort of categorize them?
Oh God, there'd be so many. There's just like, I'm still learning stuff and changing my strategy all the time. I guess the first phase would be roughly 2014 to 2020, where it was just kind of like not much of its own thing. It was mainly just a way to keep my small, tiny fan base updated on new things that I was publishing. So there was like a whole 6-year gap there. That would be phase one. And then phase two would just be, I guess it would be 2020 to 2022. And that's when I was 100% focused on growing the subscriptions, but not really knowing how to do that and trying to figure out like what were the different things that I could get people to subscribe. And I experimented with so many things, all the way from guilt messaging, so keeping everything 100% free and just being like, hey, don't you want to support this work? Like, don't you love this content I'm creating? Don't you want to support it? And that'll work to a certain extent, but it really is not a great driver of conversions, especially when you're not in kind of a mission oriented niche. And then in the beginning of 2022, that was when Substack rolled out its recommendations tool. And that caused a huge explosion in growth for me in terms of within a year, I went from like 4,000 subscribers to like nearly 14,000 subscribers. So that really was a game changer in terms of helping me scale my email list. And that was also when they launched Substack Notes. So I was able to start taking advantage of that to build the network and that. And then that was also when I started to experiment with diversifying my revenue. I opened to allowing sponsors and advertisers. And that phase was from like 2022 to early 2023. 2023 was like actually like a really disappointing and eye-opening year for me because obviously a lot of macroeconomic factors came into play from the rising interest rates and the decline in advertising revenue. And I certainly felt that, like, all that demand really kind of drive away. And I spent my entire 2023 just waiting for that demand to come back, and it never did. And then you get to basically the beginning of 2024. And this is, my next phase is realizing I'm not an ad salesperson, and I'm happy to take any revenue that comes in via like people inbound, like coming into my inbox and asking to advertise. But I don't want to be a salesperson. I don't want to be that person who's on LinkedIn every single day looking up executives at marketing companies and cold emailing them and asking them to buy an ad. I don't want to be that person. I think there was this recognition starting in the beginning of late 2023, early 2024, and this is the phase I'm in now, is realizing that any advertising money, at least that comes in for now, is extra income. I need to be 100% focused on the subscriptions, on the little bit of the paid phone calls and consulting I'm doing, things that actually there's a transactional nature between me and the reader. And I took my eye off the ball for too long on that. And because of that, there was a lot of like opportunity that I passed up to convert more people and start generating more revenue that way. So my focus for 2024 now is 100% getting me across the finish line of over 1,000 paid subscribers, and getting well into the six figures in revenue for the company, largely through generating income directly through my readership and audience.
That's awesome. That is a great segue to the component of a creator stack. So what a creator stack is, if you think about the different type of content that you put out on different platforms, it looks like a little funnel where on the top it's all the free content that you put out on Substack, and in the middle it could be the long form content that you put out on YouTube, the conversations with the podcast guests, and at the bottom it would be people who would consult you on these paid phone calls or consulting project and engagements.
So I'll tell you what I'm doing now. So it used to be almost all was top of funnel. Most of my stuff was free. All the newsletters are free. All the podcasts were free. And then I was trying to monetize through these what I call these office hours phone calls, which were these like twice a month Zoom calls. But what I found is like there were people who really loved those calls, but like the vast majority of my subscribers couldn't make it to, because they live in different time zones, they have full-time jobs. So if it's only twice a month and both of those time slots you're unavailable to attend live, then you're not getting much value out of the subscription. So now I would say in terms of my top of the funnel, it's the newsletter is still completely free. Or sorry, the podcast is still completely free. It's like an hour-long long form interview about how a media entrepreneur built their business. I cross-posted not only to the podcast apps, but also YouTube. And now I just started experimenting with creating like short form clips for like TikTok and Instagram and YouTube. And then those kind of shorter posts that you were talking about, the social media kind of quick takes and stuff, that's still completely free. And so I still send out those multiple times a day. And then that section of my newsletters are free. But if you want to read the long form essay, that I write with each newsletter, that's now 100% locked behind the paywall. So the way that Substack works is you can send out a free version of every newsletter, but then have like a paywall at some part that you put it in. So I'll put like the first 500 words of it free, and then I'll put a paywall there where if they're hooked and they want to keep reading, they have to convert into a paid subscriber. So now all my bottom of the funnel is based on most of my bottom of the funnel is based on getting people to be pulled into these like free excerpts and then convert into paid subscribers.
So now I wanted to do a little activity called
Okay.
Draw Your Income.
Okay.
So I would love to hear about how you would categorize and distribute the different sources of income into a pie chart. How
Sure.
would you do it?
So if you were to ask me this question in like 2019, it would have been 100% of my income was coming from consulting. So like I was a content marketing consultant. I did make a little bit of money from freelancing for media outlets sometimes. Like I would like write semi regularly for like New York Mag, but they didn't pay very much. It was like maybe $600 an article. The whole reason that I wrote for those outlets is because I had the prestige that I could use then to go to corporate clients and say, hey, I've written for The Atlantic. I've written for New York Magazine. I used to write for US News and World Report, so you should hire me to create content for you. So the most of my income came from these corporate clients that wanted me to create content for their blogs, their newsletters, their social media accounts and stuff. And, I had like maybe like a healthy low six-figure income as a result of that business. Now today, close to 100%, probably like 80 to 90% of my income comes directly from my readership in the form of paid subscriptions. And then also I still do consulting, but they're not open-ending consulting projects anymore. It's all through these like paid phone calls that you can do for me. So you can actually click into my Calendly and book an hour phone call. I get a lot of media executives or other like content focused executives who are thinking about a new direction they want to go in, or they're thinking about getting into a certain vertical or something that I have some expertise in. And so they'll book these phone calls with me where basically I give them an hour's worth of advice. So it's kind of like a one and done. It's very contained. And my reason for doing that is because when I do the more kind of open-ending consulting, that doesn't scale very well, and it takes away from creating content for my newsletter, which then limits the amount that I can scale my operations and everything. So it's kind of like a compromise to where I can still offer consulting, which there's still a lot of demand for, but without it taking up all my time. So that would be like 80 to 90%. And then the remaining would be sponsorships and advertising.
Wow, that's really, really interesting, because I have the notion, or like what I have seen so far, it's a lot of them over bulk of their income are from advertising and sponsorships.
Yeah.
And I found the idea of being able to monetize from a pay membership really gives you the stability, the comfort, and a more direct relationship with the audience, where you are more heads down creating articles with a primary interest for your audience, instead of just like marketing for the brands or trying to like maximize your affiliate income or something.
And to be clear, it's like a huge opportunity I'm letting go, because like there are other newsletters that operate in my space that have similar audience sizes to me that are generating well into the six figures with just advertising alone. But those creators are more willing to spend their time doing the cold pitching, doing the sales, and which I kind of wrestled with last year when I saw a slump in my advertising revenue, because in 2022, advertising made up like 50% of my revenue. So that really shows you how much I've reoriented around the subscriptions and the paid products. And I just determined I didn't want to be a salesperson. So until I'm generating enough revenue to actually hire a salesperson, whether it's on commission or contractors, I'm going to be mostly focused on the paid readership model versus advertising, even though in the short term, I'm probably leaving money on the table as a result.
So it could be about monetization, it could be also about growth. Mm-hmm. What has been the biggest mistake that you have seen or you have committed with the newsletter?
I spent way too much time, and maybe this is fine because ultimately it all fed into helping me grow my audience. And I spent way too much time hoping that I could create so much goodwill, such a strong parasocial relationship with my audience that they would just want to give me money without me having to lock a lot of content behind the paywall, because no creator likes to put content behind a paywall. They like to have their creative work consumed by as many people as possible. And there are some creators out there who have had a lot of success by keeping everything for free and really capitalizing on the goodwill that they're creating and getting people to sign up for subscriptions. But I just don't think that that's a real business. That's a charity. It's not a media business. I think I had to come to a slow realization over a period of years is that if I really wanted people to pay, I had to create something that they couldn't get unless they paid. And so hence why I made the decision to double down on reader revenue, was like gradually putting more and more stuff behind the paywall so that being not paying for a subscription, you have much more limited utility with my content or being a subscriber now than you did a year ago. So that would be the biggest mistake is just thinking that people would feel guilted or feel good about themselves by becoming paid subscribers.
It manifests itself with different kind of media business models out there. Like if you look at The Information, if you look at The Economist, or if you look at New York Times, it was kind of like you're thinking of the model that you're running with, right? But there's also like the other side. There's like
The Guardian, NPR,
The Guardian,
PBS,
CNBC.
Yeah.
So I think different models work, but you're just gonna put in the right content and be good at distribution.
Like going back to that idea of like advertising, like if I wanted to keep everything 100% free and not lock behind anything a paywall, I could do that, but I would have to become an ad salesperson and sell marketing products against it instead, which I wasn't willing to do.
So I wanted to ask this question, like what is the favorite part about your job and what is the hardest part about your job?
I graduated college in 2006 and have been working, full-time obviously since then. The last 4 years have been the happiest of my entire career. Like, it's just like so amazing that I get to wake up. I have no inner office politics. I have no boss. I get to do basically whatever I want. And that's just like such an amazing freedom. And I really enjoy that freedom. I enjoy like being able to be creative every single day. And so that's been incredible. Obviously, the hardest part is just building an actual business around this. Like back when I was doing the consulting, I wasn't like super happy, but it was much easier to generate income because there was very strong demand from on the marketing side for people who are good writers and good content creators. Basically the demand is pretty much limitless on that side. Like I could only do as much work as I had hours in the day to do it. But I was not happy because I wasn't able to be like fully creative or create content that I wanted to create. But the downside to doing that is that business is much harder to build. I'm now 4 years into it and I still am not generating as much revenue as I was back when I was doing content marketing full time. So it's hard. It's not easy. And there's a lot of self-doubt involved. There's a lot of wondering, am I even cut up for this? Like, will I ever be successful? So that's something you have to go through a lot.
And I'm sure there are plenty of people who were also feeling similar when they were going full-time with content, especially with newsletters and when they offer some kind of high-ticket consulting services.
Yeah.
What is a piece of advice that you would give to them about those things?
In terms of like just starting a newsletter or how to keep going or what specific?
Overcoming their self-doubt, like you mentioned.
Yeah. I've heard the advice is you should create like a Google Doc, and every time someone gives you a compliment, you should put it into that Google Doc so that when you are feeling discouraged, you can kind of just open that up and be like, okay, from a qualitative perspective, you're like the universe is sending you a lot of, positive vibes and encouragement. So using that to get you through the slow times, the hard times. I've never done something that was that formalized, but I will say that anecdotally, hearing from my subscribers and constantly getting that kind of like people who have they have no incentive to reply. It's not like they're getting something out of me by telling me they really like my stuff. So they genuinely actually do really like it.
I remember reading one of your issues. You mentioned a little bit about like growing up. Even before you got interested in media and business, you had a little gig or a little interest in becoming a poet.
No,
Is that
it's
true?
not a poet, a fiction writer. So like
A fiction writer.
yeah. So from the time I was in like sixth grade until like graduating college, it was my dream to write fiction. And at some point in high school, I started getting into writing short fiction and started like getting actually pretty disciplined about writing short stories. And then at the end of my freshman year, I sold my first short. So I would get like, and then I would submit them, but they would only get published in like non-paying little webzines, and stuff, which it seemed like an accomplishment. But then you realize pretty quickly that because they're not paying, there's not much competition to get into them. So you don't have to be that good of a writer to get into them. So then in the beginning of my freshman year of college, I sold my first short story to a magazine, a small little magazine, and then I started to sell them more consistently to magazines and some anthologies and through the rest of my college career. So yeah, that was my chief motivator of learning how to write, was being a fiction writer. And then I eventually wanted to like graduate to becoming a novelist or something. But then a funny thing happened as I graduated college. I had absolutely no job skills. And so it's like, what does an English major with no job skills do? Well, I guess he becomes a writer. And how do you become a writer? You probably become a newspaper journalist, since that's one of the only real jobs out there that employs writers, at least at the time. This was back in like 2006, 2007. And luckily, this was before the Great Recession, when newspapers were still hiring. And I just got an entry-level job as a reporter as a result, and then kind of built up those like reporting and journalism skills. And then I just fell in love with the craft. And I also started really enjoying kind of like long form journalism in places like the New Yorker. And I realized that I actually enjoyed doing that more than I enjoyed writing fiction. And at that point, I wasn't even reading fiction anymore. So I couldn't even enjoy the actual consumption of fiction. So basically, very quickly, I transferred from being focused very much on becoming a novelist someday to being 100% focused on journalism and nonfiction.
That's awesome. And for people who wanted to get better at writing, especially with newsletter writing, online writing, Twitter, LinkedIn, any sort of social platform,
mm-hmm.
How would someone get better in it?
It's all repetition. There's no secret to it other than repetition. You need to stop like overthinking it and just start creating content. That's like always the advice that I give, is like, all the tools are there. It's like there's been no other point in human history where it was easier to build an audience with utilizing almost no actual monetary resources whatsoever. All the free tools are out there. The only barrier to you becoming a great writer is yourself, is you not just putting in the work. As you're creating that content, you're going to start creating a feedback loop where, you put it out there and it's met with crickets, or maybe it gets a little bit of response. And every time it gets a little bit of a response, you can refine your strategy, refine your writing style, refine your content, and basically just optimize it. And that optimizing is you actually getting better at creating content for the wider market. So yeah, so that would be my advice, is just get started. Just start putting stuff out.
And before we close, like I'd like to ask our guests this question, is that if you could put up a billboard in the middle of Times Square and for the world to see, like what kind of message do you want to put on it?
It's like my version of that. What's like a takeaway from, if you were to take all my things that I've analyzed and written about over the years, like what would be the biggest takeaway? I think for me, it's that the barrier to entry is the lowest it's ever been in history. It's like the barrier to entry is zero. What's keeping you, or what difference, like the biggest newsletter or biggest reporter at the New York Times or Disney or whatever, like whatever advantages they have, like those advantages have been virtually wiped off because of the internet. With very little, very basic access to a camera, to a laptop, to a smartphone, to a microphone, you can put out content that can rival the greatest content ever published in the history of cinema or media. And so something along those lines, I'm not being very concise or well spoken right now, but something along those lines, that like the opportunity is so enormous right now and it's kind of what you're talking about, is everybody can be creative, but you can also now express that creativity to like an unlimited audience as a result.
Sounds great. It's a pleasure to have you on, Simon, and thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
So that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. All the links and resources will be shared in the descriptions. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on whichever platform that you're on. It would help us a ton to reach new audiences. Thank you so much for listening. And again, I see you in the next one.